All right, it's time for another 2024 college football team season preview and prediction, game-by-game prediction. And up today, the Hokies, Virginia Tech. That's right, we're going to do an ACC team today. Of course, Brent Pry returning as head coach there. This will be his third season there, and improved from year one to year two. 3-8 his first year there, 7-6 last year. One of the hottest team. I don't know. They were pretty good the second half of the season compared to the first half. Anyway, they lost a bunch of games in the first half of the season. They sort of turned it on in the second half of the season. They made a quarterback change during the season that kind of facilitated some of that. You can point to scheduling a little bit as part of the reason. That's one of the reasons I think that a lot of people are talking about Virginia Tech this offseason as being potentially one of the most improved teams next season. Is because of the way they finished last year. That and the fact that they have the most returning production of any team in the country. We'll talk specifically about those numbers in a second, but basically they return more starters and contributors and key players this year from last year's team than any other team in the country. An ACC schedule. Last year, they finished tied for fourth in the ACC with Georgia Tech, if I remember. Yeah. Finished tied fourth. They were 5-3 in the ACC last year. They finished behind, of course, Florida State, Louisville, and then NC State. And then they were tied with Georgia Tech. 5-3 in the ACC. Overall, 7-6. They went 6-6 in the regular season. They won a bowl game to finish 7-6. And like I mentioned, really kind of turned it around in the second half of the season. Who'd they lose to? This is where there could be a problem heading into next year. They pretty much lost to every good team they played, and some not so good teams. Obviously, they lost to teams like Florida State, Louisville, and NC State. Those were three of the better teams in the ACC last year. But on top of that, they lost to Marshall, not good. Rutgers, and Purdue. And Purdue, of course, not good at all last year. So those were their 6 losses. And then you look at the teams they beat, and again, take this for whatever it's worth, but here's the teams that Virginia Tech beat last year. Tulane. That might be their best win. And that was a bowl game where I believe the quarterback was already gone. The coaching staff was gone. Their other wins, Boston College, Wake Forest, Pitt, Virginia, Syracuse, and Old Dominion. Not exactly a list of a bunch of great teams there. So it's a mixed bag, really. When you look at Virginia Tech from last year's perspective to try to determine what that might mean for this year. It is true that they have a ton of players coming back again. We'll talk more about that in a second. It is true that they played better or won more games anyway in the second half of the season than they did in the first half. It's also true that they lost to several really bad teams and really didn't have a signature win. And now, look, it was important that they made a bowl game. I don't want to diminish that. People think what they do about bowl games these days, but when you're a young, struggling team, one of these sort of 500 type teams, it's not really the money or the fact that you get to play in a bowl game that actually matters, at least not to the coaches, if you could sit them down and get them to be honest. It's the extra 2 to 3 weeks of practice that you get. Practice time is heavily regulated in the world of college football. You're only allowed so many structured practices where coaches and athletes are on the field at the same time, whether you're talking about during the spring, during the offseason, during the preseason, or even during bowl season. So when you're one of these teams that's sort of hanging around the 5, 6, 7 win range, it's a big deal to make a bowl game if for no other reason than you get an extra 10 to 14 potential practices with your team looking forward to the following year. Now, let's take a look at some of this returning production that we talked about from last year. They returned 86% of their production from last year. That number is just huge. If you look up the list of returning productions, you'll see Virginia Tech at the top of the list. But even once you get down to like 10 to 15, you're getting close to the 50% range there in the 10 to 15 as far as teams with the most returning. To have 86% is a lot. And that represents a lot of the hype that you see around Virginia Tech this off season. They returned 95% of their offensive production. 95%, 77% of the defensive production. So they basically returned their entire team from last year. And in the world of college football, where typically you only get a kid for 2 to 3 years, sometimes 4, 5, or 6, you have the extra years of COVID and red shirts and all that. But, you throw the transfer portal in there now. What's the average number of years that a player stays at a particular school? Probably 3. In other words, this isn't the NFL where you're coaching a kid for 10 years, right? So you keep your entire coaching staff intact. You return the majority of your players on both sides of the ball, your starters. What does that mean? Well, that means they're that much more ingrained in that system the second year. We harp all the time about how important experience is, right? Well, this team has got their quarterback coming back. That's great. And this other team doesn't have their quarterback coming back. So maybe the quarterback ends up being good, but we don't really know. We've never seen him play. It's a crapshoot. Plus, even if he is good, he's a first-year starter. Maybe he makes mistakes. Maybe he's slow to pick up the play. But whatever, all these things we talk about, none of that applies to Virginia Tech. On top of the fact they returned the head coach and the coaching staff. So it's just a very smooth transition this offseason from last year to this year for Virginia Tech. There wasn't a ton of turnover as far as transfer portal losses go. And they brought in some key contributors through the transfer portal. Again, something we'll talk more about in a second. But let's look at the offensive side of the ball, then the defensive side of the ball. I'm going to put their schedule up on the screen and then go through it game by game. Now, let me give you kind of my overall perspective of Virginia Tech. There's a couple of overarching philosophies that I kind of believe in when it comes to college football. Some of them you hear me say all the time. Most teams are going to win at least one game you didn't expect them to win. Most teams are going to lose at least one game you didn't expect them to lose. The schedule, who you play, when you play them, and where you play them, all of those things are important. You can't just look at a team and go, this is what I think about this team, so therefore I think they're going 8-4. If you don't look at the schedule, if you don't know who they're playing, if you don't know when they're playing those teams, what do I mean by that? Well, in some cases, it makes a difference if you play a team in the first 2 weeks of the season versus playing them in the last 2 weeks of the season, right? Take a team, for example, that might have a new head coach or a new offensive coordinator or a new quarterback or all three. You're probably better off playing that team early in the year when they're kind of still trying to work things out, as opposed to in November where maybe they've hit their stride. Injuries. This is a case where, maybe the opposite is true. You play a team early in the season, most likely you're getting them at pretty close to full strength. You play a team in the end of the season, maybe they've had a little bit of attrition due to injuries or whatever the case. Now, that works both ways. It could also happen to your team, not just the other team. So not just who you play, but when you play them, do you play a team coming off of a bye week? Is the team you're playing, did they have a bye week the week before they play you? Are you playing a team this week who last week played their rival or who had a huge top 10 matchup the week before? And so maybe you're catching them sleeping. And of course, where you play them. Is it a home game? Is it an away game? Is it a neutral site game? So you have to look at all those things when it comes to the schedule. So I look at Virginia Tech. I see a team that, won 7 games last year, which for them is a hell of an accomplishment. It's one of the best seasons they've had in a while. Definitely the best defense they've had in a while. Again, more on that in a second. But I see a team that returns their coaching staff, returns their quarterback, returns almost every offensive weapon from last year, and returns the majority of their defense. Then I see that they're in the ACC. Then I look at the schedule and I say, okay, they play a couple of the tough teams, but they don't play. I don't see an NC State on the schedule. I don't see a Louisville on the schedule. I do see Clemson and Miami. I don't see Notre Dame. A couple of these key games they get at good times during the season, which I'll explain when I get to the schedule. So overall, coming into it, I have probably a little bit of a higher expectation for a team like Virginia Tech than maybe the average person does. Now, again, I know that they're getting a lot of hype. Another thing that I can't help but kind of think about when I look at Virginia Tech this year is Louisville last year. The way people are talking about Virginia Tech right now is very similar to the way people were talking about Louisville at this time last year. Now, it's not totally the same. Louisville got a new coach and brought in a ton of transfers, but the point is Louisville was a team that had been kind of forgotten about. That this time last year, you started hearing a lot of stuff bubbling up to the surface about Louisville and how good they could be. Very similar story with Virginia Tech this year. It finished hot last year, return everything, and you're starting to hear people say now that they're starting to dive into schedules and rosters and all these kinds of things, people are starting to go, Virginia Tech could win ever amount of games. So that's kind of how I came into this. But let's look at the offense. The quarterback is back. He was a one-time transfer from Baylor. He didn't start the season last year. Kyron Drones is this kid's name. He didn't start the season out as the starter last year, but he became the starter early on in the season. He ended up starting 11 games. In those 11 games, he accounted for 22 touchdowns. So it's not lighting the world on fire, 2 touchdowns a game. Some of the better quarterbacks are getting 3 to 4 touchdowns a game. He had 2 touchdowns a game in his 11 starts for 22 touchdowns. But he's a dual threat guy. He's not, I don't want to say, he can throw the ball. Is anybody going to list him as one of the best pure passers in college football? No, but he's one of these guys who you got to respect his ability to run. And I found this stat here that kind of highlights, I think, what I'm talking about here. Before he became the starting quarterback last year at Virginia Tech, they were averaging 60 yards a game rushing the ball. 60 per game. From the time he became the starting quarterback to the end of the season, they averaged 214 yards rushing per game. Just mind-blowing, the difference there. Now, that's not because the quarterback was running for 200 yards a game. He can run. The fact that defenses have to respect his ability to run the ball opened up some options for the other running backs there, primarily Tootin, who ended up with 863 yards and 10 touchdowns last year. They were one of the better rushing teams in the ACC last year. Wide receivers, they have 3 back from last year. Felton Lane and Gosnell, I think is the third one's name, if I'm pronouncing that right. Between the 3 of them, they had over 1,500 yards and 17 touchdowns last year. So, again, a ton of returning experience and production at the wide receiver position to go along with the quarterback. They also bring Jennings back from injury. I don't think he played at all last year, and he might be the best of the bunch. He's back. He's healthy. He's ready to go. The offensive line is a little bit of a question mark. Now, they return all 5 of the starters from last year's offensive line, but it wasn't great. I know they ran for a lot of yards, but again, that was a lot of misdirection type stuff and zone reads and having to respect the quarterback's ability to run. This isn't an offensive line that sort of lines up and pushes defensive lines downhill or anything like that. They do get all 5 back. They got to do a better job of protecting the quarterback in passing situations. They brought in the transfer along the offensive line. We'll see if he's able to compete for some starting time. But if there's a unit on the offensive line that I think could potentially hold Virginia Tech back, it's not the quarterback, it's not the running back, it's not the wide receivers. It would be the offensive line. Now let's look over on the defensive side of the ball. Top 20 defense last year, statistically. Again, people will argue about stats till the cows come home, and it is kind of true. You can almost find a stat to back up almost any belief you have about a team. But they were a top 20 defense statistically. Make of that what you will. It's the best defense they've had since 2017, or at least the first time they've been ranked inside the top 20 defensively since 2017. They've got 2 starting cornerbacks returning. Might be the best cornerback duo in the ACC. 4th nationally last year in yards allowed per game. 4th nationally in yards allowed per game. So not easy to throw on this team. That wasn't the problem. Stopping the run was Virginia Tech's problem last year. They were 2nd in the ACC in sacks, and they get, is it Antoine? I think it's Antoine. Antoine Powell. Is that his name? Anyway, they got a guy had 9.5 sacks last year. He's back. It's going to be hard to throw the ball on Virginia Tech. They've got a solid secondary, 2 really, really good corners, and a high-end pass rush. And that makes it extremely difficult for an opponent to be able to throw the ball. Along the defensive line is where they got to get a lot better when it comes to stopping the run, defensive line and linebackers. They brought in 3 transfers along the defensive line. They brought in a transfer at linebacker. And they've just got to play better overall at the front 7 against the run. If they can do that, then I think their defense could potentially take a next step and maybe even be a top 10 type of defense in 2024. I look at Virginia Tech as kind of a borderline top 25 team entering the season. I don't do my rankings based on future projections, though. So if I were to do a ranking right now and rank Virginia Tech at 25, That doesn't necessarily mean I think they're going to finish the season at 25. Maybe I think they're going 12-0 and they finish the regular season ranked 6th or 5th or 4th. Maybe I think they're going 6-6 and finishing the regular season unranked. I don't factor that into my preseason rankings. So to me right now, when you're just stacking up all the teams in college football, I think Virginia Tech is a borderline top 25-ish type team entering the season. I could see them being ranked anywhere from 20 to 25 in certain polls, and I could see them kind of just outside the 25 and some, maybe like the others receiving votes type category for some of these teams. I think it's possible that Virginia Tech wins 10 games for a lot of the reasons I've already stated, and because of their schedule, which we're going to put up here in a second. What does Vegas think about Virginia Tech? They say Virginia Tech's winning 8 games. They have Virginia Tech's win total sitting at 8 right now. Again, they went 6-6 in the regular season last year. So this number 8 represents a regular season, a 12-game win total of 8. So Vegas expects Virginia Tech to be better this season than they were last year. And I agree. They have the 6th best odds right now to win the ACC, and they're behind. You could probably guess who they're behind, but they're behind Florida State, Clemson, Miami, Louisville, and NC State. Those 5 teams have better odds right now to win the ACC than Virginia Tech does. But where was Louisville last year in the odds? So, the odds are what they are. Doesn't mean that's where they'll finish. That's just sort of how the betting public views Virginia Tech right now. All right, here's the schedule. Let's go through it game by game. I'm going to give you a winner and a loser for every single week. They start out on the road at Vandy. I think that's a win. Vandy, not only one of the worst teams in the SEC, but probably the worst Power 5 program in the country. They're really bad. They have a hard time getting talent. They have a hard time getting good coaches and keeping them. The last good coach they had was James Franklin, and of course couldn't keep him. He's been off at Penn State for a while now, but it is there. There's no reason at all that Virginia Tech should even struggle in this game. I think you beat Vandy on the road week 1. You're 1-0. You come back home and play Marshall. Must-win game. You have to win this game. You didn't win this game last year. These are the types of games that that keep you from making a bowl game, or keep you from being a 9 or a 10 team. You can't be losing to these types of teams and expect people to take you seriously. You just can't. That's just the reality, right? Think about Notre Dame a couple of years ago. They lost to Marshall in the regular season in Marcus Freeman's first year, and then last year they ended up having a decent year. I think they went 9-3. So just because you lost to them last year doesn't automatically mean you're going to be bad this year, but it's a game you just can't lose. I don't think you do. I think you start the season 2-0, first win at home over Marshall. Then you go on the road and play Old Dominion, another team you beat last year, and I think you beat them again this year. You start 3-0, 3 non-con games, and 3 wins, one being against the SEC powerhouse Vandy. So you can pat yourself on the back for that. Then things start to get a little more difficult. You host Rutgers. You played Rutgers last year, and they beat you. And I think Rutgers beats Virginia Tech again here this season. I wouldn't be surprised at the end of the year if we're looking at Virginia Tech and Rutgers, and we say, wow, Virginia Tech is clearly better than Rutgers. How did they lose that game? This is early in the year. Greg Schiano, regardless of what you think about him, he does know what he's doing as a head coach. And, Rutgers doesn't get a lot of attention. They don't get a lot of hype. They've been in the Big Ten East forever. So they just, you lose into Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State every single year. And people just kind of forget about you. But they're a decent team. I wouldn't be surprised if Virginia Tech wins the game. But again, like I mentioned earlier, Virginia Tech, I think, can be good. But they're not good enough to play at their potential week in and week out. They're gonna be a team, like almost every other team, that loses a game somewhere that you kind of didn't expect them to lose, and I think it could potentially be this one. I've got them losing to Rutgers, who, of course, again, like I mentioned, they lost to them last year. They lost to Purdue last year, so these Big Ten teams can be tricky. You're 3-1 on the road at Miami. I've already done a Miami version of this video here. I think this is Virginia Tech's biggest win of the year. I think they get this win on the road at Miami. And, I think Miami's going to be pretty good. Like I said, I've done this video already for Miami, and I've got Miami at 10-2. I think Miami's going to be a really good team. And you have to play them there. Now, playing at Miami is only a disadvantage in that you don't get your own home field advantage. Obviously, Virginia Tech has a huge home field advantage with the crowd and everything there. Miami doesn't have that. So you're not going into a hostile environment, but you are missing out on the juice you get from your own home environment. And Miami is a good team. They're more talented than Virginia Tech. Miami loses a couple of games a year that you don't think they're going to lose. And I think this is it. I think Virginia Tech gets one of the biggest wins they've had in a while on the road against a Miami team that will likely be ranked inside the top 15 when this game is played. On the road at Stanford, a newcomer to the ACC, outside of having to travel to California, I don't see any way Virginia Tech loses this game. Stanford is one of the worst. They're up there with Vandy in terms of worst teams in the Power 5. I think Virginia Tech gets that win. They're on a roll. They enter their first bye week at 5-1. Come out of the bye week and you host Boston College. I'm not expecting much from them this year. Plus, you get them at home. Plus, it's coming off a bye week. I think you beat Boston College. Then you play Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech is another team. I'm a little bit higher on Georgia Tech than most people are. Again, I've done this same video for Georgia Tech. I did it last week, and I think I've got Georgia Tech at, 7-5, when Vegas only has them winning 5 games. So I'm a little higher on Georgia Tech than the average person. But you get Georgia Tech at home, and here's the important thing here. And this is where studying schedules. Look, I don't get everything right. I'm not claiming that I know some secret formula. These are just things that I look at when trying to determine some of these wins and losses. Okay, you host Georgia Tech at home. The week before that, you're beating up on Boston College at home, a nothing game. The week before, you know what Georgia Tech's doing the week before they play Virginia Tech? They're hosting Notre Dame. A game I have Georgia Tech winning. I've got Georgia Tech beating Notre Dame, okay? A huge win for Georgia Tech. A win that they will still be celebrating when they come to Blacksburg the following week and lose to you. So people always say, like, Lou, how in the hell can Georgia Tech beat Notre Dame, but they're not good enough to beat Virginia Tech? It's not always about who you're good enough to beat or bad enough to lose to. It's about when these games are played, where they're played, all those kinds of things. I think Virginia Tech is basically resting up by playing Boston College at home the week before, while Georgia Tech is having a huge emotional, biggest win of Brent Key's career there, win at home the week before against Notre Dame. And I think Georgia Tech gets caught celebrating and loses to Virginia Tech. That's how I come to these conclusions. Again, it doesn't make them right or wrong. These are guesses. I'm just guessing. Feel free to disagree. And here's a great example, okay? You're on an absolute roll at this point here in the season. Your only losses against Rutgers. You've got wins against Miami and Georgia Tech, right? Then you got to go on the road here and play Syracuse, and guess what? I have this as a loss. I think Syracuse is another team in the ACC that gets better this year versus what we saw last year. Now, again, if Virginia Tech and Syracuse played 10 times, I think Virginia Tech would beat them 7 or 8 times. But they don't play 10 times. They play once. You got to play them on the road. I think they get a win. You come back home, you play Clemson. I think you beat them. I think you beat Clemson. I think Clemson is so overhyped this year because they're Clemson. Well, they're Clemson, and who else is going to be in the ACC? You know, Dabo won 2 natties 8 years ago. Yeah, I know all that. Also know they got no offensive line, no wide receivers, a terrible quarterback. Will Shipley's gone. Maffa is good. I question whether or not he'll be as good as he was last year now that Shipley's not there to share the workload. Their defense is still really, really good, and Virginia Tech's going to have to play a hell of a game here. But again, it's at home. Clemson's got to go there. If you were playing in Clemson, I'd give Clemson the win. I think you beat Clemson. I've already got you beating Clemson and Miami and Georgia Tech. Your only losses so far are Syracuse and Rutgers. You finished the season out on the road at Duke and at home against Virginia, and I think both of those games are wins. I've got Virginia Tech at 10-2. Now, here's the thing. When I look at everything I know about Virginia Tech, and I look at who's coming back, and I look at the coach, and okay, here's the schedule and all that, and without trying to pinpoint exact wins or losses, I look at this schedule and I go, you know what? That looks like a 9-win team. That's the kind of the thought the thought that pops into my head. This looks like probably a 9-win team. Vegas has you at 8 wins. I ended up at 10. Well, why not 9? Well, again, I've got to pick winners and losses for every single game here. So would I bet on Virginia Tech going 10-2? Probably not. Like I said, it feels like this could be a 9-win season. However, as I go through the schedule, I think you beat Georgia Tech because they're still celebrating after the Notre Dame game. Or even if they lose the Notre Dame game, it's an emotional big game the week before for Tech. I think you get them in a good spot. Clemson, same thing. They played Louisville the week before. On paper, Clemson versus Louisville is one of the biggest games of the year in the ACC. Now, I don't know how big of a game it'll be by the time this thing's actually played. We'll see. But Louisville could be pretty good. And Clemson's got to play them the week before they play you. It's hard to get up 2 weeks in a row. I think you get Clemson at home. It's like it just makes sense. So, I don't. I say I look at the schedule, look at the team, and it feels like a 9-win team. I don't say that and then force myself to find 9 wins and 3 losses. That's just kind of the overarching view that I had on Virginia Tech before I went into the schedule and started marking down wins and losses. But once I went through it, 10-2 is what I came up with. Again, would I bet on Virginia Tech going 10-2? No. Vegas has them at 8 wins. I've got them at 10 wins. It feels like 9 is probably the right number, but I've got them at 10-2. I don't know what to tell you. I've got them losing to Rutgers. Obviously, they could beat Rutgers, right? They could beat Rutgers. Okay, well, I've got them beating Miami and Clemson. Obviously, they could lose one or both of those games. So, people always want to point out one game or the other without pointing out the opposite, right? There'll be somebody in the comments that I guarantee you that's going to go, how the hell are they going to beat Miami and Clemson, but they can't beat Rutgers? Again, it's about when the games are played. Teams lose to inferior teams all the time, okay? All the time. Oklahoma State was a 10-win team last year. They couldn't beat South Alabama in the first month of the season. I mean, don't act like you've never seen the better team lose. It happens all the time, okay? I've got the better team losing against Rutgers. I've got the better team losing when you play Miami because Miami's better. But I've got Miami losing. Clemson's probably better, but I've got them losing to you. So anyway, take it for what it's worth. I've got you. I've got Virginia Tech at 10-2, losses to Rutgers and on the road at Syracuse. Knowing full well I wouldn't bet a dime on them winning 10 games. It looks like a 9-win season to me. I love the talent that's coming back. The fact that you get basically your whole team back this year, including the coaching staff, favorable ACC schedule. I mean, you play Clemson at home, an obvious advantage. You don't have to play Florida State. You don't have to play Louisville. You don't have to play NC State. Those are 3 of the best 5 teams in the ACC. You don't have to play. You only play 2 of the best 5. You play Miami and Clemson. And I've got you winning both, okay? That's probably not going to happen. You're probably going to split there at best, okay? So maybe you beat Rutgers. If you do that, you still end up 10-2. I think you get the point I'm trying to make. Anyway, let me know down below how stupid I am, and have a good morning.